All right. Cool. All right, we are live. Thanks everybody for joining us for today's Gatsby Office Hours. Marcy and Tim are going to be looking at performance. And yeah, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat. We love getting questions from you, and Marcy and I will be keeping an eye on that. So hopefully we'll get to answer everything. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Marcy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Gatsby's not accessibility office hours. That's where my brain's going. Performance office hours. I really can't turn that part of my brain off.
Oh,
Like that
that's good.
obviously goes to show. Even when we talk about performance, that's going to be in the back of my mind. Because there's some overlap there with making sure that users can visit the websites that we create and they aren't putting barriers in the way. They aren't costing people a ton of money on your data plans. And so today we're super lucky that we have a guest joining us, Tim Kadlec. Say hi, Tim.
Hi. I've been looking forward to it. It's like I said, the first time doing Twitch stuff, so that's kind of exciting.
That is exciting. So Tim and I have known each other for a few years now. Gotten to know you through the public speaking circuit, and I've always
Yeah.
admired your work about web performance. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is that you do? And yeah, I think we could start there.
Yeah. Um, so I work for myself doing web performance consulting. So right now that means helping organizations do everything from analyzing and identifying where their bottlenecks are and how do we fix those, to doing a lot of more cultural kind of things. Because I've been saying for a long time, like performance, like there's technical stuff, kind of a lot of like accessibility, right? There's technical considerations, but there's also like a mindset and a cultural shift that has to happen to have like that supporting stuff in place so that once you get fast, you stay fast. Like it's not going to just regress and stuff like that. So a lot of that. And I've been doing, I don't know, performance in some way or another for, I guess it's been somebody, I had to look it up the other day. It's like 12 years ish now. I started off just doing it as part of what I did at agencies, but then, at CDNs and in between spurts of working for myself and things like that. So yeah, it's
Oh,
fun.
interesting. Yeah, CDN, so Content Delivery Network, in case people aren't
Yeah.
familiar with
Yes.
those. Yeah, because you worked at Fastly, or where were you doing that work?
At Akamai I
Akamai,
was
that's
at.
right.
Yeah, yeah. Yep, that was right. Yeah, it was fun. It was good. It's a smart. It's a whole nother side of it too. Like once you're at the content delivery network side of things, a lot of your focus turns to network protocols and stuff that, you know, coming as a front end developer was like my starting point. Like it was kind of the dipping my toes into sort of that whole other side of things, which was really interesting.
That is so interesting. Yeah, I guess my sort of analog to that was going and working on accessibility testing tools. So, like coming from that general front end developer experience and then going into tooling, you really do learn about so much of how things like really work under the hood and sort of the how the sausage is made, so to speak.
Yeah.
And with web performance, that would be so fascinating because some of the stuff can be a little bit I don't know, like theoretical almost. And so getting to see firsthand how that stuff is applied, on the edges of the networks,
Yeah.
that sounds so fascinating.
Well, I think it's like, I mean, I think this is just kind of the way I roll, but like, I feel like the closer you look at anything, the more interesting it gets. Like when you get down to like the nuts and bolts of, just pick any topic. Like I had a brief stint, a sneak where I was on more the security side of things. And then so I was like looking at other things around like cryptography or understanding like how the HTML parser makes security issues. And it's like, once you get into the minutia of like how that stuff works under the hood, like it just becomes fascinating. And it also, I think, makes it a lot easier for you to separate theory from like reality. Like we talk, like in performance, there's a lot of talk about like this best practice or that best practice. And a lot of times there's confusion because then people will be like, okay, well, I've got to do this because I heard this was a great thing to do. And then maybe they don't see any impact on their performance, or maybe it actually degrades performance. And it's because like best practices, we call them that because they work for a large percentage of people, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right or most impactful thing you could be doing. And if you kind of know what's under the hood, then it becomes a lot easier to sort of predict or understand, like, okay, that one I can kind of ignore right now, or this one actually applies. Or if I do this, this is what I'm potentially trading off in the process.
Yeah, there's some really interesting lessons to kind of gather from that. And that for a lot of folks, debugging something like performance or accessibility, often at the beginning, you're going off of a checklist or, suggested list of things to fix. And you go through them and, do what you can to respond to whatever information you've been provided. But as you learn more about it over time, you learn the nuances and sort of what's most important, what's going to have a bigger impact. But it's totally expected that when you're just getting started, you're not really going to know what is going to have the biggest impact
For
necessarily,
sure.
and so you sort of just try it all and see what see what
Yeah,
shakes.
I mean, it really is like this is, we've talked about it, you and I, plenty of times, like the parallels between perf and accessibility. And that is like one of them. Like for me as a performance person coming in and, being conscious of accessibility, uh, and trying to apply that on any given site, that's where I'm at. I can get through like a checklist and maybe a few things beyond that, right? I have like some basic understanding of things like the accessibility tree and stuff like that. But at some point, it absolutely turns into, I'm not sure what I should be doing next, or like understanding this versus that, or doing things and then accidentally messing it up for someone. Like there's this whole learning curve thing that I think hopefully, yeah, I'm glad that you said it's understandable, like that everybody or expected would be at that point, because like that's how I feel on that side of things for sure.
Yeah, well, in terms of what you've seen with web performance, what do you think are some of the top problems that people ship on their websites? Like, what's the most common things that you have to fix?
Well, so I'm going to caveat this by just saying this is the popularity of the popularity of specific tools or specific approaches influences that, right? So
Mhm.
um my last couple of years has been a lot of JavaScript profiling and analysis. The first however many years of doing performance work, I don't know that I ever really cared about JavaScript. Like, I don't remember doing much with it other than saying, let's make sure we load this asynchronously so it doesn't block the display of the page. Most of the stuff that I was doing was like, oh, you're making sure that we're using subdomains, which you don't necessarily want to do anymore, but like doing that so that you get more requests out at once, making sure that the order of your scripts and stuff are loaded in a a good order so they're not blocking display. But we didn't really care too much, or at least most of the stuff I touched didn't have to worry about like how long it took to execute that. And now it's like there's still a lot of that. There's still like, the network level and how the browser is parsing things and stuff like that. But a ton of my time now is digging into flame charts and figuring out like, okay, why is the JavaScript execution taking so long? And what can we do to break that up? And I think, that approach to development has just gotten very, very popular. And so that's one of the things that I run into probably the most. And again, so sample bias too, like people who come to me are folks who are at an organization. They probably already know they have performance problems. They're just not sure how to solve it, or maybe they ship something new and things are not performing well. So I'm going to be a little bit biased towards people who are already having like significant performance challenges. Like you're not usually hearing from somebody who's just like trying to get a couple hundred milliseconds off. They've got big issues. And most of the time that stems from that side of things nowadays.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, there are those stats about how much JavaScript is being shipped on websites and trying to always get that size down so that well, no matter what you're shipping, be it
Yeah.
HTML code. I mean, I've seen some huge HTML pages too,
Me
like
too. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
the minified ones that you're just like, how is there this much
Yeah.
stuff on a
Or
page?
CSS. Like, I mean, literally any
Yeah.
asset. Like, I was somebody the other day had like, I don't know, it was like 6 megabytes or something like that of CSS being pulled in. Like,
Whoa.
it was like, it's like, there's a lot of stuff that it's easy to inflate any one of them, really.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when you have maybe a big content management system, or I mean, I remember working on
Yeah.
target.com, like they had Sitecore or I forget what
Yep.
system it
It's a
was, but
popular
I
one.
mean, you're so when you're creating content or components or whatever your part of the software development lifecycle is, you might be so abstracted away from what ends up being compiled and shown to a user that might not even, I mean, you have to go test it, but like that might be a whole other department that's in
Sure.
charge of that. So it can be so like you talked about culture, and I mean part of that might be tracking down who has the power to actually change how this stuff is bundled, or how do we get that 6 megabytes of CSS? Like that's
Yeah.
such an organizational puzzle to go and find out who owns what, where's this coming from, and how do we change it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's at least half the battle in any organization that wants to make improvements and then have it stick, is like getting that stuff sorted. And there's been like different like some people I think are really hardcore about like let's have one dedicated performance team, and that's their thing, is they're going to be kind of the folks going out and doing things. The approach that I kind of like, that I've seen a few organizations do, they call I call think of it as like a hub and spoke thing, where maybe there's like a couple dedicated perf people, and these are like your ultra performance, like they're the ones who are going to do like the deep dive analysis of your metrics or your site and like hardcore profiling. But in most organizations, there's probably a ton of people who care. Like there's a lot of people in any organization that care about like keeping things accessible or keeping things secure or keeping things performant. So you have maybe a couple dedicated perf people, but then you have pockets of folks that are interested in performance and care about performance, and they're in the different teams, and they're sort of to some extent helping to own performance within their respective team. And maybe they're not the ones who get to dedicate 100% of their time to it, but they're still kind of coming back and sharing with the group and making sure that the performance is, being considered within, whatever departments they happen to be in. And that kind of thing works, I think, a little better from a scale perspective than just having like 4 or 5 people on one team and it's their job to like track everything down.
Yeah, hopefully there's someone
Yes. Yeah.
somehow
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
tracking it. It
Hopefully.
is interesting how much of a parallel there is with performance and accessibility, because that model of having champions and people
Yes.
on various teams to sort of keep their attention on those concerns can work really well, because then it's sort of spreading the workload across multiple teams and multiple people, and but you can still have that affinity group and come together to talk about best practices and what you're seeing in terms of performance. It seems like that would work really well,
Yeah,
especially in large organizations.
it's spreading the workload. It's also like kind of what you were saying there, coming back and sharing best practices and stuff. But it's also like sharing like spreading the knowledge on that side of things then, right? Because like, yeah, then the idea is that hopefully all of the champions, whether it's, maybe it's like a once a month thing or whatever it happens to be, or maybe there's just like a dedicated wiki internally or something where folks are then sharing like performance wins or losses, like regressions, like documenting them and sort of having a place where they're sharing their findings with everybody else. And because you now have pockets of people everywhere, those learnings can then be applied in other parts of the organization and stuff like that. So yeah, I really like that approach.
We have gotten some questions.
Oh, rock
Uh,
on.
oh, well, first question's a pretty great one. When is Tim going to start a Twitch channel where he live streams fixing perf on real sites?
That's all right. That sounds fun. Yeah,
From
stay
E
tuned.
Runyon.
Stay tuned. Oh, Eric, nice. Yeah, stay tuned, Eric.
Great question, because I would love to tune in for that. It is interesting, and talking to an expert, and like you can learn so much that, yeah, that would be amazing. So I give that a major thumbs up
Yeah.
to that
It's
idea.
not a, it is one of my it's not a bad idea. It is one of my favorite things for my ways to learn like more performance stuff or other things too, is just watch other people kind of digging in. It's always interesting
Yeah,
stuff. Like if you've
yeah,
ever watched like the Chrome team dive into like a performance audit using Chrome DevTools, it's always just like I have Chrome DevTools probably open half the day every day. And anytime I watch like Paul Irish or somebody like that fire open their DevTools and like how they're working through things, I'm like mind blown, picking up stuff left and right. So yeah, it's a really interesting.
yeah. I've been enjoying participating in some of the Smashing Magazine conferences and like webinars and stuff because they do encourage that sort of live experience because you can see someone work on something and go, oh,
Sure.
well, first of all, they're human. And you
Yeah,
don't
that's
know,
nice too.
you put these experts up on a pedestal and think they know everything. And they're just
Yeah.
people figuring it out like everyone
Oh, yeah.
else, and so I love that experience of seeing learning how to think through a problem, not just what's the
Right.
answer. So I find that to be really useful. So we're gonna do some of that today.
Definitely.
We had, one more question. Andrew Litchford, do you have any suggestions on where or how to store visual assets for better performance, mostly photos on larger websites and e-commerce sites? Is something like Cloudinary a good tool?
Yeah. So visual asset like management, that's one of those things that I think it's Jason Grigsby had I think it was him. I sorry, Jason, if I'm quoting someone else in your name, but like I'm pretty sure he said something to the extent of like if you're like at a large scale site, your photos, your images should never be coming out of Photoshop. They should have like some sort of a workflow, some sort of a process or some system that's kicking them out. Because it's one of those like low hanging fruit things. It's like optimizing images should just never be something you have to think about. It should just be taken care of. And sometimes if it's a small enough site or you've got the you know, the ability to the compute time and stuff to be able to deal with it. Maybe you're doing that yourself. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, if you're using something like most of the CDNs, I think, have some sort of an image management system. Cloudinary is probably the most well-known and widely used commercial one, and they do a really good job. But the nice thing with something like that is they'll compress it, get rid of all the extra bytes. They can serve the good ones can serve the best, latest, and greatest formats for the browser that happens to be in use, which saves even more um, and can do that all while balancing the quality, like making sure there's not like a regression in the visual quality, so you're not suffering on that side of things. Like there's all sorts of funky formulas to make sure that you've compressed things without making the image worse. There's actually one that won like an Emmy or something like that, one of those formulas, which is kind of cool, like a little tech algorithm thingy winning an Emmy. But like, yeah, so I'm a big fan of those kind of things, services. So yeah, if you've got the CDN that you're powering, check with them. Cloudinary is a great source. Yeah, something like that.
So for what you would gain in terms of like compression and sort of like modern formats, sort of, I'm curious if there's any like, do you get dinged by not self-hosting stuff? I guess if you're using a CDN to host assets, like there's some real nuts and bolts with like web performance and like hitting multiple domains and stuff that I'm curious about. I guess if you're,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
does that
so
kind of a
yeah,
negligible
so
hit?
it can have a hit. Um depends. So if you're using, like, let's say you're powered by Akamai or Cloudflare or Fastly, then in all likelihood they're using their edge servers, but it's still your domain. Like it's still marcysutton.com where the assets are coming from, or walmart.com or whatever, and so it's not a problem.
Hmm.
But yeah, as soon as you start pulling something from for Cloudinary, for example, it's like res.cloudinary.com. Um, that's another domain, which means now the browser has to figure out what to like. How do I talk to that domain? So I have to go through the whole process of figuring out what IP address res.cloudinary.com lives at. Then I talk to that server and set up a connection, and then I negotiate the SSL stuff, and then I can request the thing. So anytime you're pulling in a third party, like assets from a subdomain or a third party domain, something like that, and incurring that extra connection cost, there is some overhead. Um, the question with something like Cloudinary, if you're using it for images, images don't block display of the page. So if Cloudinary takes a little bit longer to come back, it's not like your entire site's going to be down. Unlike if a JavaScript file from some other third-party service failed, it could potentially break everything, or CSS, could completely mess up everything. Like images are non-blocking. Um, so what the worst thing that's going to happen is your images are going to arrive much later than you'd like. Um, so the question that's where the cost benefit analysis comes in. Like, am I gaining enough by shaving size off of these images to justify that extra expense? of the request. And I think even Cloudinary has like self-hosting options, and or if you're using something like, one of those CDN servers, you can do things like, use Cloudflare workers to write JavaScript at the CDN level that would basically route Cloudinary's request through your domain so that the browser doesn't make the extra request. There are things you can do to offset it. But yeah, it's a good point, because anytime you're pulling in from that third party domain, you have to go through that whole other connection process, which slows things down.
Yeah, interesting. It's like there's trade-offs with everything.
Always trade-offs, yeah.
Always. We got another question. My window will work. Somehow I lost them. It was a
Sure, I can read it for you. It was
okay,
from
thanks.
Mayan198. Is there a good single resource to learn about over 80% of web performance optimization, or could you just pool together knowledge from a lot of disparate sources?
Oh, good question. Um, I mean, I guess here's what I'd say. Like, if you're just kind of getting started, and I think that we're going to kind of get into this too. But if you're just kind of getting started and you're trying to figure out like where do you go first, or what do you get started with, like I think that's where a tool like Lighthouse can be a really nice gateway for that, because it is going to give you like a score based on a limited amount of metrics, and it's going to point out a limited number of potential optimizations. So it's sort of by default zooming in to just give you some constraints around what you're worrying about or what you should focus on. And each of the optimizations that they provide in there are well documented, so you can learn more about like those particular resources. I think that's a good starting point for that perspective. Although getting back to one of the things that Marcy and I have talked about, like, uh, yeah, when we talk about like the nuts and bolts thing, like being able to understand what's going on under the hood, I'm also a big fan of like starting with the mechanics of how the browser works. So I talk about that like in any performance workshop I do. I lead off with like, how does the network and browser work? But if you're not going to sit through an entire workshop, Katie Steeler Miller has a fantastic talk, Happy User, Happy Browser, where she kind of goes through sort of that basic process of like, this is how a request gets made, and this is what happens in the browser once that request has arrived. And like just understanding that opens up so much information around like your core, like these are the performance things that I really need to be keeping an eye on, just by understanding how that process works. So that's a great talk if you want to check that out.
Nice. Yeah, I was also trying to pull up an article, sort of old by now. It's called "How Browsers Work: Behind the Scenes of Modern Web
Oh yeah.
Browsers" by Tali Garcial and Paul Irish. It's from 2011. So
Okay.
browsers have probably changed a bit by now, but that was like the first deep dive intro into how browsers work that made such a big impact on me. And the video, unfortunately, is no longer on Vimeo. There was a talk version of it that she gave,
Okay.
but she did so much research into how browsers work. And at that time, there weren't things like web.dev and Lighthouse and
Yeah.
like all of these tools. And like it's changed a lot since then. But I just found this so interesting to know about the various stages and like how you go from HTML and JavaScript and whatever code you're putting on the internet to something that is displayed. Like, how does that process go? And so, yeah, I would second that sentiment of if you're interested in this space to learn a little bit about how that happens so you can understand how rendering, like what it takes to get from point A to point B.
Yeah.
There's a lot involved. Like browsers are very advanced. It's
They're
pretty
clever
awesome.
things. Yeah. Yeah. No, I remember. I know which article you're talking about, because I've actually hasn't been that long since I've looked at it. There's still like sometimes some minutia or whatever that I'm trying to remember. And yeah, I remember that post. I think 2011. You said.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm dropping it in the chat. Um, oh, cool. And thanks to Nikki T online for dropping a link to Katie's talk. Yes.
Awesome.
Thank you, Google. All right.
Oh, and
So this
also,
is
sorry, Tom Peralta had a question.
Mhm.
After the latest Lighthouse update, their performance score went from plus 80 to almost half, pointing to issues that weren't there before, like too much unused JavaScript. Is there a reason for this?
Great question.
Yes. Um, so this is a good segue, I think, into like where we were, some of the stuff, Marcy, you and I were talking about before the thing about, or before the Twitch stream. Uh, so Lighthouse, the newest version, I'm actually going to share my screen to show because there's a nice little calculator that I'll zoom in on this a bit. Um, okay, so let me bring it up. Okay, so first off, let's take a step back. Like, okay, Lighthouse is a tool it's built into Chrome DevTools. It now powers Google's Page Speed Insights thing for analysis. It's inside of a variety of different like monitoring services. Like it's all over the place. And it started off as an extension, but the idea is with Lighthouse, you get a score, a grade of how your site is doing in a number of different areas. So performance is one of those, accessibility, SEO, that kind of thing. So if I were to run, so I'm inside of Chrome DevTools right now. Let me just zoom in and make it nice and big. So if I were to run Lighthouse on Marcy's site, and just for speed purposes, I'm going to run just the performance category. Oh, you know what? Accessibility too, because we've been talking about it. Why not?
And
Can
are
I do
you
that?
in an
I'm not going to get you in trouble, am I?
No, no.
Okay,
No,
good.
I mean, I would love to know if there's issues
Okay,
on
good.
this
Yeah, fair.
page.
All right.
That's the whole point, is to come in and
Yeah.
make this stuff better. I know it's not perfect on performance. I try to go and check things periodically. My question for you quickly was, are you in an incognito browser window?
Oh, good question. No, I'm not. I'm not in incognito. So one thing to keep in mind with Chrome is Chrome, if you have extensions running, all those extensions are going to mess with your Lighthouse score.
Mhm.
They're also going to mess with your network panel, your performance panel, any analysis that you do inside of DevTools is recording all the browser activities. So that means if extensions like Evernote Web Clipper is running some JavaScript, that JavaScript execution is going to influence your scores and your metrics. Some people and I did this for a while, I would use an incognito window because then you could avoid the extensions and all that kind of jazz. But the incognito window has some interesting constraints. I don't remember the specifics around something to do with some level of caching. There's something there that gets messed up a little bit. There's also a bug in incognito right now around, I believe, one of the resource hints, pre-connect or prefetch, something doesn't work in incognito mode the way it's
Mm.
meant to work. So what I find is better for like having that sterile testing environment without having to deal with like the weirdness of incognito is inside of Chrome. I just have a separate user profile that I keep clean. So if I'm in Chrome in the top right corner, there's these three little dots. Um, or I'm sorry, right next to that is like the little circle, which you probably can't. It's like the little gray head right now because I'm not signed into anything. If you're signed in, you'll probably see your picture or whatever it is.
Oh,
But
yeah.
if you click that, you're able to choose like different profiles to use inside of Chrome. Or if you don't have a different profile, you can click add and pick one. So I have one that's called Perf Testing, which has, I think, React DevTools and Vue DevTools installed for the extensions, but they're off. I have them off unless I need them. But that way I can test anything in that separate profile. And I know that what I'm seeing is just how your site is performing, not how my extensions are messing with it.
Nice.
That's a
I'm
great
gonna do
question.
I am going to do that from now on.
Yeah, it is nice because I can't tell you how many times I've debugged the site or tried to figure out what was going on, and it should be easier than it is. But like eventually, I realize, oh, it's because the Evernote Web Clipper is doing this or whatever. Which is still, that's, by the way, it's a whole fascinating area, by the way. And I think it's if you're like super keen on like if that kind of thing is interesting to you, Debug Bear, like 2 years in a row now, have put out a post where they test the performance of top Chrome extensions and like what the impact is on the page. So like this is like
Interesting.
next level performance geekiness. But like if you're ever curious, um, that's a fun one to dig through.
Oh,
But yeah, so
interesting.
for analysis, I like to stick with like the site itself and just be, yeah. So no, so if I run Lighthouse here, what it's going to do is it's going to pull Marcy's site up, test it um, for a bunch of different audits that are related to performance and accessibility. Look at that accessibility score. That's awesome. Uh,
I would hope.
it's,
Doesn't mean it's perfect, but
yeah.
it's a good
No,
starting
no.
point.
Well, yeah, just like, I mean, that's a good caveat. Like, just like with performance, like the Lighthouse score of 100, if you hit it, you're probably in decent shape. But it doesn't necessarily mean that like everything is ideal. And I think it's even like less so the case for accessibility and stuff, the way that score is calculated.
Hmm.
Um, so with performance, it comes back and it's going to show you some key metrics that are related to the score, and then give you suggestions for optimizations. Now, this is one of the things that confuses folks. And getting back to that original question, the suggested optimizations, these opportunities and diagnostics, improving these doesn't necessarily do a thing to your score. Like the score could care less about any of these like suggestions, whether or not they're fulfilled or not. The score is entirely based on how you did on these metrics, um, and whether those metrics are considered good, average, or bad. Um, that is what impacts the score. So from here, you can click on. I forgot they added the link here. I pulled it up in a separate tab. If you're curious about how that's calculated, there's a calculator right here, where you can play with these metrics and the different scores. And right now, it defaulted to what Marcy had, and you can kind of see like um, what what how high could we go with our Lighthouse score if we improve this metric, or if this metric regresses, how much better, how much worse are things going to get. And it also tells you in this little grayscale, so hopefully it's not too bad to see, but like how much weight each of these metrics gives to the score. Um, so this is getting back to the JavaScript thing and how I've talked to a lot of companies who've seen the same thing. Like when this new version came out recently, their performance, their Lighthouse scores dropped, and it's typically those folks that had a lot of JavaScript running on their site. And the reason is because of the different metrics that were added and some of the weighting differences. So if we go back to, I think I actually am going to show up the other bookmark that I had, because there's another view of this that shows here. Let's close. Let's not close. Let's open that in a new window so I don't lose your thing. Here, I'm going to zoom back out a bit. So this one shows the newest version, V6, and then the previous version, and what metrics came into play and how they were weighted. So in the previous version, there's like 5 metrics that got weighted. First contentful paint, like how quickly does the first piece of content get up onto the screen? So text, image, something like that. Speed index, which is like a measure of how quickly the majority of the content gets displayed on the screen. First meaningful paint, which is now basically gone the way of the dodo bird, but it was an attempt to figure out like, oh, something meaningful was painted to the screen. Time to interactive, like how long does it take until the page is consistently interactive and ready to be, if people are going to use the site, it's going to respond quickly. And first CPU idle, at what point does the CPU get idle? Do we have like a block of the main thread where we're free for responding to user interaction and stuff like that? The new version added a couple metrics like largest contentful paint, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But that's in addition to first contentful paint, which is just, the first thing that gets out on the screen that's content. Largest is looking for your largest piece of content, your big image or your big chunk of text. And how quickly does that get painted? But it also added total blocking time, which is how much time does the browser spend running JavaScript where it's blocking it from doing some other work? And cumulative layout shift, which is measuring, visual changes basically in your page, like visual stability. Do things move around a lot while the page is being loaded, or do they stay mostly where they were meant to be? But the big difference, the big reason why people have seen the degradation in scores then is because if you look at the new version, timed interactive and total blocking time, which are both very heavily impacted by JavaScript execution. I mean, total blocking time is just JavaScript execution, um, basically, is 40% of the score. So if you're shipping a decent amount of JavaScript, and I think the person asking the question mentioned they had a fair amount of unused as one of the diagnostics. So chances are there's a good chunk of script there. If you're shipping a decent amount of JavaScript, it's almost guaranteed that your Lighthouse score dropped with the new version, um, because it's coming into play on those metrics. And again, that's 40% of the score right there.
Yeah.
So,
Wow. Yeah,
yeah.
that result, you can see it on my site, and I'm guessing pretty much any Gatsby site probably has that. And so, yeah, it'd be cool to talk about that. We were talking a little bit before the call about this concept of hydration and how the way that Gatsby sites load is you've got your HTML so that if a user turns JavaScript off, which there are valid reasons for doing so. But in most cases, unless you're creating what we call client only routes to have, content that's either authenticated or, only shown if you're navigating with JavaScript, like setting that aside for a moment. Gatsby's HTML pages load content and then they hydrate into React web applications using JavaScript. So there is a bit of a duplication of effort. The promise of that is having this rich interactive space to be able to do things for those subsequent pages. So optimizations for images, detecting if things are in the viewport, preloading content on that next page if the user, if they have show an intent, like they're going to go to that page, Gatsby preloads some of that content to make that load really fast. And so a lot of the performance metrics I've seen are so based on this like single page load. And what I'm curious about is this kind of whole website experience, because the amount of data that your site could be loading overall as the user is navigating on a phone, or I mean, I was thinking when I'm traveling and my data cap, like I'm
Yeah.
tethering off my phone and going over my data, like really how much you're loading overall is going to have the financial impact on a user. And so this hydration effort, what I'm curious about measuring is this overall data size when the content is not being loaded from HTML pages on every single page. It, like in Gatsby, it's a JSON file and it's loading just the content for the next page. So that's sort of the like context of how Gatsby sites work right now. And so looking at that first page, these metrics, I'd love to dive in more to what it is finding. And my site's a great example to look at because it uses Gatsby. And so for anyone listening, some of the same, you might have some of the same results.
Sure. So yeah, so maybe should we look at yours then, I guess, for like the jumping
Sure.
off point for that then? Okay.
Yeah. Because I have the
Okay.
same result
Yeah.
as what Tom Peralta was asking. So,
Okay.
and I even saw it on your screen there on the other
Yeah.
tab.
So here, this was the Lighthouse score for yours. Um, so the other thing to keep in mind, by the way, just because like it's well worth bringing up, Lighthouse can be run from any machine and from a number of different services, which means that if I'm running a Lighthouse on my machine against Marcy's site, and somebody is watching this and ran it on your site on their machine, the score could be very, very different because the hardware impacts the score. Like I've got a relative, like, I don't know, not like the newest, but I think the version before that, like MacBook Pro that's kind of souped up, right? So mine's going to be able to churn through a lot of JavaScript by default pretty easily. Even with a little bit of throttling applied, it's all relative, right? Like if we throttle the CPU, it's relative to the fact that it started off from a really powerful starting point. Somebody's running this on a 4-year-old or 5-year-old machine or something that's more typical, like something that a normal person would buy off the shelf. The performance score might be a lot worse because it might take a lot longer for that stuff to execute. But likewise, if you're running Lighthouse through a Google tool like PageSpeed Insights, or you've got a tool like SpeedCurve or Caliber, that's, these monitoring tools that are giving you Lighthouse scores, the number is going to be different because it's like testing from different locations on different hardware. So there's going to be some variability there. So that's worth noting just before we dive in, just because if anybody is
Mhm.
following along, I don't want them necessarily like, if
Hey,
they've
it
got
looks
very different
different.
results. Yeah, exactly.
That's a really good point to learn, and I mean, yeah, talking about time, I mean, that's gonna vary, for
Oh
what
yeah.
machine you're running it on, and now I understand so much more about those what the services can offer you, if they're automatically testing it in various, contexts. That would be
Yeah,
super helpful.
it's the stability is a big thing, and like that's what a lot of the good services will do is they'll test like X amount of times and then check to see how much the score varied. And if they varied by too much, they'll retest. Like Caliber, I know talks about doing this. Like they'll run another set of tests just to make sure that if there's variability, it's like reasonably like there's a reason for it, not just because something spiked and got weird. So the stability and consistency for testing is a big benefit to using services like that. But yeah, if we're looking at yours, and I think that like the specific numbers changed, but I think the basic gist was the same when I looked before the call too. Um, you have speed index, that visual perception stuff, getting things to be interactive. Even your total blocking time at the moment on this, again, keep in mind that this is a powerful machine, was 0 milliseconds. You had no long running JavaScript tasks. Layout shift wasn't a problem. Your bigger concerns were first contentful paint and largest contentful paint. So when do we get something on the screen and when do we get our biggest stuff on the screen? Um, so if we're trying to figure out how do we improve the Lighthouse score on marcysutton.com, that's where we're looking. Um, Personally, just for like the stability and the repeatability of things, if I'm digging into a site for the first time, I may look at the Lighthouse score just to kind of get my bearings a little bit. But from there, I'm probably going to end up jumping into web page test, and then jump back into Chrome DevTools when needed. Um, so with web page test, if you're not familiar, like this has been around since basically the dawn of performance, and it's ridiculous that this tool is free. Like a lot of commercial services are based on top of this. A lot of large mega enterprises are running their own private instance of web page test for free. It's just a browsers use web page test to check new features in the browser to make sure they're not regressing on performance. Like it is an absurdly powerful tool that's run
Isn't
by
it running in yeah, isn't it like running in Pat's basement or
Yeah,
something?
so Pat Meenan is the guy who built it, and the biggest testing location. There's testing locations all over, but the one that if you really want to churn through your test and get it out fast, instead of like waiting in a long queue, you use Dulles, Virginia, and that is Pat's basement. And somewhere he's got a post. Somewhere he's got a post online where he's got like a photo of all the devices because they're real devices. He's just got shelves and shelves of phones and laptops in his basement, just sitting there. I don't want to know what his electric bill is or anything like that. But yeah, it's impressive. Yeah, it's a great tool for testing. And getting again, you get some repeatability because I can choose, you know, to run it on a specific device from a specific location using this browser. So in this case, I'm saying use the Moto G4, which is like a midish tier Android device out of Pat's basement. Run it using Chrome. This is the network I want to use, like a 4G, or he's got a bunch of presets so you can have something custom. How many test runs do I want to do? Typically, I would bump this all the way to like 9 if I'm doing this for reals. But for speed purposes, like in a demonstration, you probably keep it like 1 or 2 times. The reason why you'd run more tests though is again that variability. Like if there's a weird spike or a weird anomaly, you want to know that it was a weird spike or anomaly before you spend an hour troubleshooting it. You can choose your first view and repeat view. So getting back to like once stuff is cached, what does it perform like? And then if you're using things like there's a whole bunch of stuff like you can put in your own custom headers or inject JavaScript to manipulate the page somehow, or uh, run scripts that do things like navigate to a bunch of different pages all at once and see what happens, like one after the other, or click on a button and see what happens. Like there's a whole bunch of advanced stuff. Um, for cleanliness or speed. Oh no, did I do it in the other? Hold on. I just say for speed, I actually ran this ahead of time just because I wanted to make sure we had something to look at and didn't have to wait for it. So I'm
Smart.
just, yeah, sometimes I am. So this is just a test that I ran before. I don't know if I can, yeah, anybody who can, if you can drop the link in Twitch. I don't think I have Twitch open to be able to get to the chat, but so this is the results, like once you've ran a test. So this was a test of your encouraging contributions with docs post on Chrome with 3G fast. And web page test gives you, similar to Lighthouse, you kind of get like some base scores across the top on some basic optimizations, which you're looking great on. And then you get like this summary of metrics. And below that, the test results. Now, the metrics, he's highlighting some key ones. If you go back to the Lighthouse scores, anybody saw the announcement on Core Web Vitals, which is like some of those Lighthouse scores that Google is saying in particular are especially important. And in fact, they're going to start using as part of their search engine algorithm next year. Pat's got those highlighted here, the Web Vitals stuff. And he's doing the same red, green, yellowish to tell you if it's good, bad, average. The only one that I think that we saw on your site from Lighthouse that was a little like that wasn't included in these web vitals that was jumping out at us was the first contentful paint, which he's got over here. So I like this because this I've got some repeatability to kind of keep going back to and rerun from the same conditions and know that I've got some stability to it. But I'm seeing basically the same results from web page test, right? It's like your layout shift is nothing to worry about. This one's giving you a little bit of a hit on total blocking time, but that's because now we're testing it on like an Android device versus a souped up MacBook Pro. But it's still your first contentful paint and largest contentful paint, which are the two that are getting flagged the worst. So I literally feel free to stop me at any time. I'm basically just going to show you exactly like I'm just going to look at this and figure out like why and show you how I
Yeah.
work through that.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Because my first, like, when I saw that result the first time, I was like, oh, is it images or is it scripts? That's kind of
Sure.
what my question was, because it doesn't really make it clear. Like, how do you
Yeah.
figure out what is the thing that's causing the
Not
largest
always.
contentful
Yeah.
paint?
Not always. So what I'll do then is I'll click the link right here that says run 3. That's the median run based on speed index metric, just to see the results. So here I've got a tiny little thumbnail of the waterfall, which is all the resources on the network. I've got the screenshot of what it looked like at the end, and then I've got a few different views. Like I can get into like the timeline and trace like Chrome would provide. Or my favorite view for starting with is the film strip view. So if I click through to that, what I get is I get this film strip across the top that shows a visual progression. I'm going to change the interval of the thumbnails to 0.1 seconds from 0.5 just to have a little bit more granularity there. But so I get this progression of how the page load occurs, which in your site is a little boring. Like we see a difference here when a web font comes into play.
Which, fun fact, that is the Seinfeld font.
Is it? Nice.
Yeah.
Fun fact. Awesome.
It's not italics.
I did not know this. Okay, so if you but on other pages, sometimes you'll see a lot of shifting around. Yours is, the font comes in and you can see some stuff shifts. Then, it's got a different height and stuff to the font, but that's about it from that perspective. But the reason I like this view is because if you'll notice, there's this red line to the left here as I'm using through the film strip. There's also on the bottom, it shows the waterfall of the network activity, and there's also a red line. And so as I'm moving through the film strip, it's moving the red line on the waterfall to that point in time. So this is really handy for example, we knew your first contentful paint was right here. That's when you get your first bit of content on. It's also your largest contentful paint had the same metric in this case, the same number. But if we line it up roughly there, that means on the waterfall, it's just this activity to the left of that line. Like anything that happens to the right, I don't really care about if I'm debugging these particular metrics at this point in time. And I can even make this easier inside of web page test. There's up at the in the actual URL, the last parameter in the URL is end equals visual, which says set the end of the waterfall to like when it's visually complete. If I replace visual with 3.1s, what it's going to do is it's going to cut the waterfall off just at that point. So now I'm just looking at what happens before your first contentful paint occurs and your largest contentful paint. So I know that anything else does not matter. Um, so he draws a green line here that indicates when that paint occurs. So the other thing is I can safely say that request 15 and 16 don't matter because they're not completed. Maybe I should back it up. For each request in the waterfall, you'll see a couple things. So first off, on your first request for the HTML, we see this bar over here that's got a little itty bitty bit of teal, a tiny little cute thing, some orange, and then purple. That's just terrible. Me talking out loud, it's not always interesting. So what that's showing us is that's the connection state. So that's like, okay, the browser found is getting the request for the HTML. The little bit of teal here is a DNS resolution where it's figuring out like what IP address to talk to. Then it's doing our TCP connection, figuring out the SSL stuff, and then it's going to start requesting the file. Each of the requests are color coded, so blue is HTML, orange is JavaScript, green is CSS, etc. For each of these bars, the light part is where like we're waiting for content to come back, and the dark shaded parts of the color, that's where the content is actually being actively downloaded over the request. Um, so what that means then, if we look at like request 15 and 16, we can see that they're started. The browser started to request your thing from Typekit, and it started to request the ping. But you'll see the content. We haven't hit content download for either of those, and we've already painted. So they don't block screen like painting at all. So the only thing that we're potentially impacting this metric with are request 14 up. So just really high level, like walking through what we're seeing here, we're seeing the HTML. As the HTML comes back, it looks like you've got a bunch of scripts coming down. And then that's that JSON data that you were talking about. That's the
Mhm.
content for, looks like specific page data to this. And then there's, I guess this must be like a generic general like data for your site wide or kind of a thing.
Yeah, I'm guessing I'd have to go look at these bundles. But yeah, there's like the code that you ship, for your content, and then there's the stuff that Gatsby uses to create like the React web application that
Okay.
hydrates and does the preloading and prefetching and all of that stuff. So there are plugins you can use, like if you really don't want client-side routing or hydration, you can turn that off using a plugin. You can also use a Preact plugin to cut down the bundle. Like I might look into that for my own site,
Sure.
if that will help me get the file size down because I'm not doing a whole lot of interactive stuff. I do some, but like I don't even have a hamburger menu anymore for accessibility purposes.
Sure.
Um, so yeah, I guess it does look a lot like, from 14 and up, it's a lot of the JavaScript bundling. Um, so yeah, I
Well,
guess
yeah. So I think there's a caveat there. So first off, purely from a page weight perspective, I agree. Like if you were to use, I think Gatsby's got the Node.js plugin, and like there's a couple other things to maybe swap out or like eliminate some of that script. All that stuff goes away. Um, but um, the question, like, there's two things. First off, is like I actually don't think that that's your primary bottleneck for your first contentful paint, though.
hmm.
Um, and here's why. I'm guessing it's line 12 and 13 more so.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
let's take a look at the actual source and see how these scripts are being loaded. So I'm going to go back to the page. I'm going to hit view page source. Oh, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to open this up in DevTools because it'll format it nicely. So if I've got your page open, I'm back in Chrome DevTools. There's a sources panel. which shows like the source code with nice color coding of everything. Um, Chrome has these awesome like abilities to search the sources or search the panels using like the master search. If anybody's used like VS Code or anything like that, and you're used to Command Shift P letting you search your project, it works in Chrome DevTools. So Command Shift P on the Mac, probably a Control Shift P or something like that on a PC. I'm not exactly sure what that would be,
Probably,
but
yeah.
yeah, okay. Command Shift P on a Mac lets you search like all the different panels or all the different tools inside of DevTools, which is handy. Or Command P lets you search all the different files. Um, so if I wanted to look at, let's see, how would I type this in? Yeah, just start typing in something. So I just started typing in encouraging because that's the name of the page here. You see the first result that's coming up here is an index file. So if I hit enter, oops, not Python. All right, enter. There we go. We'll see the source code now of the actual page itself. And even better yet, we can hit this big old pretty print button, and that should give it a nice clean format. So this will just be a nice way for us to like look at the source code with it all nicely color coded and formatted so we can figure out what's going on. So if we go back to web page test, I'm just going to grab like the name of one of these files was Webpack Runtime. And I want to start Command F to search and look at how that's being loaded. Okay, so these are all being preloaded. So that's a resource hint that says like, hey, this is important. I want you to put this towards the top of the queue, download it as early as possible. So you're preloading all of those scripts as well as the JSON files. That's why when we look at the waterfall, they are the very first things requested.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And Gatsby's doing that part all for me behind the scenes.
Fancy Nancy.
It is
Awesome.
fancy.
Yeah.
But it looked like there was font stuff before that.
Yeah, there's a font thing coming in down here in your waterfall a little bit later. Which I think yeah. Oh, you mean up here font stuff before that?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yes. So I follow you. Yeah. So you're inlining the CSS, which I'm assuming is part of what Gatsby is doing for you as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is a great optimization for speeding up those first paints because now the CSS is right there in the HTML. You don't need to make another request to get it. But the reason, and here is where you're defining your fonts. Fonts are a little funky though. The browser has a very, if you're not using it, I'm not going to waste my time with it approach to web fonts. So whereas with CSS, as soon as it sees it, it's going to start to download it. If it sees a request or JavaScript or whatever, queue it up. With fonts, what's going to happen is the browser's first going to download all the HTML, parse it, download all the CSS, create the CSS object model, like all the potential CSS that could apply to the HTML, download any JavaScript that needs to be executed, run that to see if that manipulates the JavaScript or the CSS object model. And only at that point, then it's going to combine the HTML and the CSS object model to create the render tree and figure out, okay, this is the stuff that actually needs to be displayed on the screen based on the CSS that we've got here. And at that point, it's going to say, oh, now that I know what needs to be shown on the screen, I see I need this web font. I'm going to go request it. So even though you've got inline CSS and you're referencing the fonts at the very top of that file, those fonts aren't going to get requested until that CSS has been fully parsed and the HTML has been parsed, and the browser knows for sure it needs the font. So that's why the font comes in so late on the waterfall here, despite being referenced right away.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting.
Do we have a strict time on this? Because I just realized I just looked at the clock. Do I have to shut up?
We try to wrap up at 3:00. If we go a few minutes over, it's okay, but our captioner also has to leave to do other things. So
Okay,
not too far
let
away.
me. How about, is it okay if I think like just to show really quick on the paint thing, I'll try to be as fast as possible and we can get out. But I don't want to like leave you hanging figuring out what that was. So anyway, so going back to the Webpack runtime thing, you're preloading it, but the actual script itself looks like it's being loaded at the very bottom of the page using the async attribute, which says, download this file, keep parsing the HTML while you're downloading it, and don't run until that file arrives. which theoretically would push it out of that path a little bit and let the browser parse the HTML as quickly as possible and get everything painted out on the screen. As long as the HTML was parsed before the JavaScript got downloaded, the JavaScript wouldn't block display at all. And parsing HTML is really, really fast, and all your CSS is in line. So it has all that information like right there. So I think the bigger problem is lines 12 and 13. You mentioned at the beginning those separate domains and how you have to go through the extra requests.
Mm-hmm.
So you're using cdn.polyfill.io, which is a great provider for polyfills based on which browser's in use. But that's a JavaScript file that's loaded from another domain, which means that we have to request it, like connect to that domain and download this JavaScript before we can display anything, because this is going to be a blocking JavaScript file. That's the default here. So I can't display anything until this arrives. And the other one that's blocking is your p.typekit.net request here. If we go back to your inline CSS, that's being included as an import, which means the browser sees it and it's like, oh crap, there's this other CSS file. I also have to get that before I can figure out what the CSS object model is and get things painted off onto the screen. So it's not going to be able to figure out what to paint out until that file arrives as well. So you have these two files that you can see the connection time. If we look, it's somewhere around 256, 400, 500. So like a good second, 1.1 seconds or so to connect to these different domains for tiny files in the end. But that's a good 1.1 seconds. It can't paint anything until that stuff arrives. So that's your bigger blocker here. So if you really wanted to speed up first contentful paint and largest contentful paint, it would be either look at an alternative service for providing polyfills or routing it through your own domain.
I have to figure out where that polyfill is even coming from, to be honest. It might be getting downloaded like from this typekit thing. I'm not really sure. I have to go and look.
Yeah, so the typekit, I mean, this typekit thing, I've seen this before. This is I think they're using this purely for tracking, which sucks. But like,
yeah, that does.
This is the entire source of the file. So I think it exists entirely. I think it exists entirely so they can keep track of stats. But because they're doing it as an import, you have to wait for the whole thing to download before it.
I'm sure it's because, they have restrictions around fonts to commercialize it. I mean, that was a big reason. It took a long time to get web fonts because of the licensing. Yeah. So I get it. But I might end up finding my Seinfeld fonts just not that important.
Or what you could do is you could like pull that part out of the inline CSS maybe and make it asynchronous. Filament Group has a good blog post on this.
Yeah, I think sometimes with these services, your hands are tied a little bit because that's the method they give you to load it.
Yeah.
They'll have to play around with that.
Yeah. If you have the ability to pull it out of the inline CSS, you could potentially reference it as an external style sheet, call it a print style sheet. Once it loads, switch it. And that would mean it doesn't block display. Your fonts are going to arrive potentially a little later than they are right now, but at least you get your content out faster.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's kind of like, that's what's impacting those paint metrics in your case. In your case, it's actually not JavaScript execution. There's not a ton of that happening.
Nice, because I mean, I will play around with getting that file size down just because it sounds like a cool thing to do. But it's nice to know that that's not the primary thing that I need to do. Especially because that's automatic JavaScript stuff from Gatsby. And so, yeah, good to know that that's not actually what's causing this slowdown here.
Yeah. And now for other folks, if they see total blocking time spike, if that's a bigger metric, then they've probably got the JavaScript thing. It becomes a much bigger focus. But yeah, for yours, there's not a lot of work happening on the JavaScript side of thing. Even on this, we didn't see a lot of blocking JavaScript. So yeah, it's more that loading process.
Cool. Well, I guess we're about ready to wrap up. We did get one question about what's the URL for that metrics calculator. You can get to it from Lighthouse. right? And if Tim, if you drop any links in Zoom, then I can port them over to Twitch.
Awesome.
I was looking at Caitlin's name, which starts with a K, our
It's okay.
captioner.
It's all right. It's visit hold on, I'll drop in a link for the scoring calculator there. No, it's there was a virtual conference that I was on. Phil Hawksworth was also on from Netlify, and twice, both while being introduced, and then once by being thanked, I think by whoever the MC was, as well as once by a person in Slack on the back channel. They both called me Phil, so which actually I'll take as a compliment. I like, Phil's a good guy. I'll take that. But yeah, it happens.
Nice. Well, Tim, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for joining. I learned so much, and we had some comments from folks saying that they learned a lot too. So this was awesome.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Sorry we didn't get to go into more metric stuff, but it was fun.
There's more to learn, obviously.
For sure.
And yeah, now I know where to go from here.
Yeah, well, we can always come back to it sometime, maybe. So thanks everybody for joining us today. We do office hours every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern, which is 11 a.m. Pacific. And thank you, Caitlin, our captioner today. And if you don't follow us already, now's a good time to do that. And we'll see you later. Thank you so much.
See you later.